Hello, and welcome to another episode of Lawyers for Immigrants, where we're dedicated to helping immigrants and new Americans. Every episode, I interview different lawyers across the practice spectrum and ask them how their practice benefits immigrants. Today, my guest is Joshua Wurtzel, a partner at Schlam Stone Dolan. Josh is a commercial litigator and a business dispute attorney. His slogan is, "When your business gives you hell, call Wurtzel." So thank you, Josh. Happy to have you on my show.
Thank you, Yifei. Thanks for having me.
So Joshua and I were previously professional acquaintances at BNI, Business Networking International, and the two of us were the lawyers who would consult with each other often on business disputes and immigration matters. So Joshua, please share the area of law that you specialize in.
So I'm a business litigation attorney. So there are kind of two pieces to that. I handle litigation, which is different from transactional matters, contracts, and so on. Do a little bit of that, but primarily focusing on litigation, which is suing people in court or being sued by people in court. And the business aspect is, I do commercial litigation, business litigation. So primarily disputes among businesses or business people. And within that, my focus really has been a lot of commercial real estate litigation. And that really takes on two practice areas. One being commercial leasing litigation, so representing mostly commercial property owners against tenants. And then the flip side of that is representing commercial property owners against their commercial lenders. So a lot of different things, but also a few very specific things.
Okay, and just for the listeners' purposes, can you please define what litigation is?
So litigation is when when one person sues another person. Or you could have arbitration, which is outside of court. But at its most fundamental level, litigation is when the most common example. You get into a car accident, and the other person ran a red light and damaged your car, and it hurt you, right? So how do you recover for that? You bring a lawsuit, you file a complaint in court. And you go through the litigation process, meaning you go through the court process to ultimately try to recover for something that you've lost. So I don't do the example I gave as a personal injury example. It's not what I do. But my clients, a lot of times they've been, I have a lot of clients who have been defrauded. They've been based on false representations that someone else makes. They give up money or they give up a business. And they lose it as a result of this fraud. So we have to bring a lawsuit. We file called a summons and complaint, either in state court or in federal court. So when somebody says I'm going to take you to court, that they're talking about litigation, and that's what I do, day in and day out.
I see. And do you have any immigration clients or clients who are immigrants?
So I don't do any immigration work, right? That's when I usually call you. But I do have clients who are either immigrants or non-U.S. Based clients, and that becomes significant in commercial litigation, for a number of different reasons. But I think often most significantly, the interplay between immigration and not necessarily immigration law, but people who have come from outside of the United States and are doing business in the United States is kind of how people say all politics is local, right? Well, I think all litigation and all business is also local, and a lot of we've seen instances in which people have gotten into disputes because the custom where they, in another country in Europe or in Asia where they were doing business before is very different from in the United States, and that leads to disputes. And that's often how I end up meeting those people.
Okay, can you give an example of how the custom would cause a dispute in terms of a dispute here in the U.S.?
Uh, so, you know, I think the way that it often happens is, you have a business, you have somebody who is, does business outside the United States, and they want to break into either the New York market or, a non-New York market, but within the United States, right? Well, how do you do that, right? If you've been running a business somewhere in Asia or in Europe, how do you break into an American market? Well, you might have contacts in the United States and you can connect with those people and so on. But a lot of times people, companies will, let's say, hire somebody, a consultant or another company that does something similar to what they do, or that can fulfill part of a contract or part of a deal for them. And you associate with those people. And a lot of times it works out very well, but sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't is because sometimes it's because of a mismatch in expectations, and that often arises from cultural differences and also just different expectations in different places. But it also arises because you have a need. If you worked in New York or in the United States your whole life, doing in the technology field, you don't have to necessarily hire somebody to develop an app for you. If that's what you've been doing and that's what you know how to do, and you know how to do it based on rules and regulations and so on in the United States. But if you're from out of the country, now you have to deal with another party, and if that deal goes south, that often is how these business disputes arise.
Okay, so an example would be, for example, an international company or a company from overseas wanted to do business in the U.S., so they hire sort of a local company to assist in their business operations. But then, for example, the local business here, who's not affiliated with the company overseas, they get into a disagreement or dispute over certain products or contractual terms. Is that what I'm getting at? Is that how usually the disputes
Yes,
come?
yes, that's one of the ways. Correct.
I see. So that's like an example of a contractual dispute case. Are there any other types of litigation matters that might not involve contractual disputes? Like in terms of, we agreed to X, but you said Y. So that's like contractual dispute. Is there any other type of commercial litigation that you are involved in?
I mentioned before, I do a lot of, I do a lot of fraud claims. So, I have a lot of clients come to me, and they, this is not unique to non-U.S. clients, right? I think, many U.S. clients come to me and say the same thing. They say I've been defrauded. And I think a lot of people don't actually understand what it means to be defrauded. A lot of people think that if someone else stole from them or didn't live up to their contractual obligations, that means they've been defrauded. That's wrong. Fraud is something very specific. It's when somebody makes Yifei, I tell you, I tell you something about my business. I tell you that it makes $10 million a year, and it's got 100 different customers, right? And relying on my representations, you say, okay, Josh, I'll give you $1 million for your business. And I sell the business to you, and you find out it wasn't making $10 million a year. It was making $100,000 a year. Instead of 100 customers, I had 10 customers, right? So you relied on my false representations. You'd have to prove that I knew they were false, that I made them knowingly at the time, that I knew that they were false at the time that I made them. You'd have to show that you reasonably relied on my representations. In particular, you'd have to show that you did some type of diligence, or that you couldn't have found out the truth, or that there wasn't some type of red flag that pointed you to the truth. You'd have to show that you lost money, that whatever you gave me was worth less, was worth more than what you actually got, what the actual value of my business was. But we tend to see a lot of those types of disputes. We also see a lot of business divorce. And again, this kind of, I'd say this is not unique to whether it's non-U.S. or U.S. parties. when you have people who are in business together, whether they're partners, they're members of a limited liability company, shareholders in the corporation, oftentimes they have disputes, and that's what we call a business divorce. And one person's looking to cash out of the company, somebody else wants to continue the company. One person is stealing from the company, and the other person is trying to recover from it, and so on. So those are the types of matters. And I don't know that any of those matters are unique to American parties versus non-American parties. I think it's something that anyone who's doing business is going to, or often, has the potential to encounter. But when you add the component of, one party is either outside the U.S. or one party, has come to the U.S. from another country, now you're adding an additional layer of complexity, right? Where you have someone who might not be as familiar with U.S. laws or with the way things that are done in the U.S. and they might be more vulnerable to to being defrauded or to being stolen from, right? And that's where a lot of my clients come in. They are people who have, whether they're immigrants or not, they're people who were in a vulnerable situation someone else took advantage of.
Right. So in both the context of the fraud case as well as breach of contract as well as business divorce, from the perspective of an immigrant, they're more likely or more susceptible to being taken advantage of by their American counterparts or by more sophisticated parties, or someone who doesn't have a position of being overseas, or someone who don't understand their rights here. So in terms of immigrants who know their rights and those who don't, like, how would you characterize your clients? Do these people know their rights before they're taken advantage of, or are these people just being preyed upon by sophisticated businessmen in the U.S.?
So I think that's a loaded question, right? I would say most of my clients, my firm, tend to be fairly sophisticated. But even the most sophisticated business people can be taken advantage of, can be defrauded, can be stolen from. So I wouldn't say that most of my clients are would fall in the ultra vulnerable or most vulnerable category. Most would not. Yet we still have plenty of cases with partners stealing from somebody else, or somebody not paying somebody, or fraud taking place. So I think if in many ways, if you are ultra vulnerable, often the most successful people, who are the most sophisticated, those in many instances are the people who are most likely to be targeted for fraud, right? Because if you have no money, you're not all that much of a good target for fraud. There's not much to get from you. But if you have a successful business, right, you've built up, you've come to this country, or you started out in this country, you've built up a successful business, and you have a product line, you have a revenue stream, you have goodwill, right? All of a sudden, somebody might be interested in doing business with you, right? And that's where you really have to start protecting yourself. So I think it's wrong to say that someone who is defrauded or who's the victim of some type of wrongdoing, or gets screwed out of money, right, that they're vulnerable, and more vulnerable than somebody else. In many instances, they're more sophisticated. It's just that the more balls that you have in the air, the harder it is to watch each ball. And that's where I think sophisticated counsel, like yourself, comes in to be able to advise business people, generally about how to protect themselves.
Right. So, but then you yourself would be someone who would be involved when shit hits the fan, and then these people have been taken advantage of, and it's time to get their money back or to get their business back. I'm sure you've seen instances where people who've signed business agreements had their business transferred inadvertently to another person, and it's just tragic about what happened, because oftentimes they're immigrants, and the other person might say, oh, hey, you're an immigrant, so you never should have started a business here in the first place. So, but I mean, my question to you then is, do they have rights? Do immigrants have rights to enforce their contractual claims or to enforce their business claims? And if so, what are these rights?
Absolutely. I mean, so absolutely. I mean, look, I think I personally have not seen an instance where someone inadvertently transfers their business to someone else. I think what's more likely to happen is, you're overseas, you have a partner who's in the United States and you're overseas, right? Your partner is running the business here in the United States and relying on your partner, to properly account to you. What are the profits? What are the revenues? What are the expenses, and so on. This goes on for however many years, and all of a sudden you find out that your partner, instead of giving you, your 50%, is only giving you 10%, and is just telling you that the business was making less money or had greater expenses. I mean, that's a very typical type of fact pattern that we have, and often it's not with not with necessarily with somebody overseas. It's with somebody, in the United States. But I think it's even easier, to be in that situation when you're, when the person who has his or her hands on the money and on the operations is, when the other person has their hands on the operations and on the money, right? And if the business is taking place in the United States and you're not in the United States, obviously the internet and, you could be just as involved in a business from, the other side of the world as you can if you're physically sitting here. But in many businesses, it is difficult to run your business from the other side of the world. So you have to rely on people who are actually in the location where your business is taking place. So those are the circumstances under which I tend to see issues. In terms of do immigrants have rights? I mean, the answer is 100% when it comes to business disputes. I know very little about what rights you have as an immigrant outside of the business world, but I think for the most part, your business rights as an immigrant, the law is not going to distinguish. Now, obviously, there are unique situations, like if you're on a sanctions list, against the Russian government, right? You're not gonna have certain rights that everyone else will have. But for the most part, you have the ability to bring a lawsuit regardless of whether you're an American citizen, regardless of whether you're living here. And you can take advantage of the U.S. Justice system as long as there are obviously rules about where you can sue, and there has to be a connection to where you're looking to sue and so on. But to answer your question, right? Do immigrants have rights when it comes to business suits? The answer is a resounding yes.
Okay, so generally, the place where they would want to sue is where the business is in the U.S., right? Like in terms of where they want to bring the lawsuit, if they're overseas. So if they have a business in New York, they would want to bring in New York. If they have a business in Michigan, they would want to bring in Michigan. Is that generally correct?
Yes and no. I mean, the rule is that where you sue someone, the court has to have personal jurisdiction over the defendant. So, if you're in New York and I'm in Florida, and you want to sue me in New York, I have to have some connection to New York. Now, if I'm running a business in New York, it doesn't matter that I live in Florida. I could live I could live in Russia. I could live in London. I could live in Japan. It doesn't matter where I actually am. I don't have to be a resident of the location where you're suing, but that court has to have a basis to have personal jurisdiction over me. So that's always something that you're thinking about when you're deciding where to bring a lawsuit. The other thing is, I sue you in New York, and I get a judgment against you in New York, but you don't have any assets in New York, right? All your assets are, let's take two examples. All your assets are in California. So now I have to take my New York judgment and get it domesticated in California and try to enforce the New York judgment there. Now, that's in many instances better than just bringing the lawsuit in California, because I want to be in New York. New York's better, right? For whatever reason, you've decided New York is better. Right? The court has personal jurisdiction over your person, right? But none of your assets are in New York. So that's why you have to domesticate and enforce the judgment in California. But let's just say, and I have had situations like this where somebody's assets, are out of the country. We've had situations with people with assets in South America and Asia, and Europe. And in those instances, it obviously becomes more difficult to enforce. You usually have to hire counsel in the foreign jurisdiction. So let's take China, for example, right? You'd have to get a Chinese lawyer, and you have to get the Chinese lawyer to domesticate the judgment in China. And every country has a different process. In New York, there's a process for domesticating judgments from other countries. And, if you have a judgment from one country that is going to be better than maybe a judgment from another country. But every country has a process, and you have to look for the assets in that country. And obviously, depending on where you're looking to enforce the judgment, is going to depend on what that process is and how difficult it is.
Right. So, that just goes to show what a great lawyer Josh is, because not only is he thinking about the dispute itself, the litigation, the juicy part, he's also looking out for his clients and the recovery, because that's sometimes the most important part, because you can just get a judgment on paper, but then if there's no assets behind it, then it's meaningless, because sometimes the collection part is probably the most difficult, especially in blatant cases of contractual fraud or contractual breach. So anyways, Josh, how do you prove these issues when you're dealing with immigrant clients? Because, for example, they might just suspect that their business partner is cheating them, and then they come to you. So how do you come up with these proofs that would hold up in a court of law, especially given the lack of communication you might have with the overseas client, or the lack of concrete proof that might result? So how do you go about? What's your process like to meet the evidentiary burdens of the lawsuit?
So I think the answer is the same for whether the plaintiff, my client, is outside the U.S. or is in the U.S. You have to, and oftentimes there's something that triggers. Let's just take the example before. You've got a plaintiff who's outside the country and they have a 50% partner inside the country, and they learn at some point that the partner was taking way more than his or her share, right? Well, how have you learned about that? Is it that you saw documents, somebody said something to you, things just all of a sudden started to be suspicious? So the most important thing in a case like that is you want to be able to get the financial records of the business. You want to be able to get bank statements. You want to be able to get credit card statements. You want to be able to get tax returns. You want to talk to the accountant. That would be a first wave of documents. What a lot of unscrupulous people will do is they'll say, okay, the business made $1 million, had $1 million in revenue, and we had $800,000 in expenses, and we each made $100,000 in profit, right? But that $800,000 in expenses, maybe half of it are personal expenses of the person who's running the business. They're charging their vacation, they're charging a luxury rental, they're charging their lease, and all those things, right? So you're going to want to get the business's credit cards. You're going to want to get the bank statements and see what charges the business is paying, right? So if you see the bank is paying personal credit cards of the defendant, right? Okay, well, were those credit card? You need now the defendant's credit card statements, right, to see whether those statements in particular, show personal charges or business charges. And this often is where a forensic accountant comes in. We have a lot of cases where we work with forensic accountants, and we give them, it's our job to get all these documents, and then they do the hard part of going through and identifying the different expenses and trying to itemize and figure out what was business, what was personal, and how much was actually taken.
Okay, great. So we're getting to the conclusion of our show. But before we go, we would like to ask you, do you have any other lawyers that you might recommend for this show that would be beneficial, or any resources you might want to share with the listeners of this show?
So, in terms of resources, my firm, we publish what's called the Commercial Division blog. It comes out 3 times a week, and it reports on business decisions in the New York State Commercial Division. And A lot of people might say, well, I live halfway around the world, or even I live outside of New York. Why do I care about what's going on in the New York State Commercial Division? Well, New York is really the center. The New York court system, is where I would say, most or many business disputes are brought. New York actually allows you to put in a contract that even if you're outside of New York, you can still you can agree that your business case will be decided, will be litigated in New York. New York has set up specifically what's called the commercial division. In Manhattan, we have 8 judges that are that only deal with business cases. The threshold is $500,000, and they deal with the contract, the fraud, the breach of fiduciary duty, and so on type cases. So, so this blog publishes regular decisions about that. So, that's a great resource for lawyers. But even for non-lawyers, I've had non-lawyers who have found blog posts online and called me up to ask questions about it. So, I recommend anybody taking a look, taking a look at that if you're interested in business law and kind of how New York courts deal with a lot of these things.
Great. So yes, thank you, Josh, for coming on this show. Again, Josh Wurtzel is a partner at Schlam Stone Dolan, and he's a commercial litigator. And well, that concludes our show. Again, this is Yifei He, where we put the grant in immigrant. Be sure to check out our podcast on all streaming platforms, including Apple, Spotify, and more. And we look forward to hearing from the next guest. Thank you very much.